Well, good evening and welcome to this VOA WION co-production. Let's get straight into the show. The U.S. officials have continued efforts this week to build a dialogue with China, even as the U.S. lawmakers heard serious warnings about threats to cybersecurity. Voice of America's congressional correspondent Catherine Gibson wraps up this week in the U.S.-China relations. Here's a report.
Amid strained communication lines between Washington and Beijing, Chinese President Xi Jinping welcoming former U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger to China. Xi noted that Kissinger, who turned 100 in May, has visited China more than 100 times since the 1970s.
The relations between our two countries would be central to the peace in the world.
U.S. climate envoy John Kerry also in Beijing, restoring dialogue on environmental issues after China suspended those talks last August in response to then Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan.
We all hope nothing will get in the way of our ability to deal with the climate crisis, because, as I said previously, it doesn't wait for these things.
And U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, who visited China last week, now in Vietnam talking about the U.S. approach.
We are actively trying to promote greater resilience in our supply chains, and that doesn't mean doing everything ourselves, and it doesn't mean, in our case, ending our, in any way, trading relations with China. But we do want to partner with more countries.
China's ambassador to the U.S. telling the Aspen Security Forum Wednesday his country is not seeking conflict with the United States.
China is opposed to any kind of trade war, technological war under the pretext of competition. China do not shy away from competition, but the definition of competition by the U.S. side, I think is not fair.
But the White House telling VOA Thursday military-to-military communication remains closed.
You want to be able to pick up the phone and talk to your opposite and try to take the tensions down and to avoid miscalculation. When you have that kind of military hardware sailing so close together, flying so close together, the potential for miscalculation and risk only shoot up if you can't talk to one another.
U.S. lawmakers heard warnings earlier this week from top energy officials that China posed a serious threat to the energy grid and cybersecurity, drawing a rebuke from the Chinese Foreign Ministry.
The U.S. should not make unfounded accusations or smear other countries for political purposes, but should stop cyber attacks on others and strengthen international cooperation to earnestly safeguard cybersecurity.
The U.S. Senate began debate this week on the massive annual defense bill that contains several China-related provisions.
These investments strengthen our warfighting advantages, exploit adversary vulnerabilities, and address critical operational challenges in the Indo-Pacific. They provide capabilities that will serve to strengthen our combat-credible deterrent by ensuring we can prevail in conflict.
China expected to be a top issue next week when Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin traveled to the Indo-Pacific region. Catherine Gibson, VOA News, Washington.
Well, so China continues to dominate at least much of the discourse in the United States. Let's also focus on some domestic issues in America. And joining us now with additional analysis is Voice America's correspondent Jessica Stone. She's live with us from the White House. Jessica, thanks for talking to us this evening. Given that now there are reports of the U.S. ambassador and some more top officials, their accounts being hacked in the U.S., with this fresh round of hacking, how are the U.S. officials and administration really tackling this issue back home?
Well, it's certainly a high matter of concern. In fact, U.S. Ambassador to China Nicholas Burns, who, as you mentioned, is one of those who the U.S. believes was hacked by a Chinese-linked group, he warned his counterpart in China directly just after we discovered this news within the last 24 hours. Assistant Secretary for East Asia Affairs Dan Crittenbrink also a target. And previously, we knew when this was announced last week that Gina Raimondo, the U.S. Secretary of Commerce, has also been targeted in this Chinese hack. And we know we use the word targeted because U.S. officials have described this as a surgical effort. In other words, not a broad effort, but really targeting specific high-level officials. Many of these people have been involved in setting up and accompanying these visits. For example, Dan Crittenbrink went along with U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken to China in the last month. And these officials were also working on the arrival and the exchange with Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary. And as you mentioned, going forward, we will have the visit to the Indo-Pacific region of Antony Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State, and the U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin. The terms of how this happened, what we know is this was an exploitation of a Microsoft Cloud issue, which we're told has since been fixed. But this is a matter of great concern because, again, it was a surgical effort. And so we know that the U.S. government is constantly under attack by various groups, but in this case, these attacks seem to be targeted at specific U.S. officials.
Right. Jessica, then also let's talk a little bit more about that visit. As you mentioned, to the Indo-Pacific, the U.S. Defense Secretary and the Secretary of State will be traveling to the Indo-Pacific region. What do we know about these travels? And also, this is an important area for America now. It's increased its, its relationships with countries in the region, like, for example, with India, Australia, and really looking at this region with an eye on China as well.
Absolutely. And of course, we've seen over the last 3 years of the Biden administration that they are attempting to repair, renew, and reinvigorate relationships throughout the Indo-Pacific region, which had been either ignored or downgraded under the Trump administration. So, for example, in Papua New Guinea, which has not received a U.S. presidential visit, it is now going to be the first country to receive a U.S. Defense Secretary, a sitting U.S. Defense Secretary visit by Lloyd Austin, who will go there early next week. He's expected to engage with them largely around the issue of the new defense agreement with Papua New Guinea, which gives U.S. military forces access to those bases on board, allows them to improve the infrastructure there and to use it. And both Austin and Secretary of State Antony Blinken will then go on to Australia, where they will work on increasing those ties. And as you mentioned earlier, along the lines of the Quad, the AUKUS agreement, these are a reinvigoration and a strengthening of ties with Australia. And Secretary Blinken, by the way, will also go to the island nation of Tonga, where the U.S. is now putting a new embassy, and he will unveil that embassy. That's important because there has not been a large U.S. diplomatic presence in the region for some time, and under this administration, they are implementing new embassies in Fiji, in Tonga, and elsewhere in order to have a presence on the ground, which of course is important in increasing communication around these issues.
Jessica, thanks for that. Well, stay with us. We have more news coming in, and Jessica is going to continue to report and throw light on many other issues. And employees of a beauty salon, or several beauty salons in Kabul in Afghanistan, have staged a protest following the recent Taliban order that will close all women beauty salons in less than a month. Thousands of women will lose their jobs if the order is implemented. Voice of America's Wahid Fazi gets us the story.
The Taliban security forces used water cannon and fired shots into the air to disperse dozens of women protesting the recent ban on the women's salons. These protesters chanted, "Don't take our jobs," and bread, job, freedom and justice. A demonstrator says she joined the protests to demand her rights.
I was one of the women who participated in the protest today, asking for our rights, asking for work, asking for education.
The Taliban said that the services offered by salons were forbidden in Islam. Although women's beauty salons are operating with no restrictions across Muslim-majority countries. Protesters many of whom choose not to give their names, say the Taliban's decision to ban salons could push people further into poverty.
Indeed, we want to know where the order is coming from. Why do they take people's livelihood from them? Why do they push people into poverty? If parents are jobless, how would they feed their children?
The beauty salon ban is the latest in a series of restrictions on women in Afghanistan. The Taliban also prohibit women from accessing secondary education, employment, and public spaces.
I think what is happening to women and girls is terrible. It is a violation of human rights. It is a crime against humanity.
The United Nations has called on the Taliban to withdraw the ban, which the UN says will impact negatively on the economy and contradicts state support for women entrepreneurship.
The whole city of Kabul is facing a problem. If the beauty salons are closed, these women won't be able to find jobs elsewhere to have an income.
According to a source at Afghanistan Chamber of Commerce and Investment, there are more than 3,000 women's beauty salons in Kabul and around 12,000 across the country. Wahid Faizi, WION News, Washington.
And well, Jessica Stone continues to be with us. And Jessica, you know, one of the major concerns when the US and other Western allies left Afghanistan was about human rights, about the rights of women in Afghanistan. The deadline for many Afghan refugees to receive legal status in the United States is just weeks away. Where do things really stand now?
Yeah. Well, this is a heartbreak for so many of the Americans that worked alongside these Afghans, whether in the civil service or in the military, because there is a program called the Special Immigrant Visa that is to be extended to them. But so many of them did not have the documentation or the time to apply for it. We had 100,000 Afghan refugees come to the United States 2 years ago during August 2021 after Kabul fell, and they came under what's called humanitarian parole. This is the same status that's extended to many of the refugees coming across the southern border, and it gives them 24 months in order to get their papers, in order to get status. But the problem is that these 2 years are now up, and there is no permanent way for them to get legal status in this country to work. They are supposed to get this SIV. There's an enormous backlog in the U.S. government to process these visas, and that gives them the ability to work. The White House has asked Congress to pass legislation to expedite these, and there is also legislation in Congress to do so, but the recent defense bill that was passed by the House and still has yet to be passed by the Senate does not have the language necessary in order to do this. So the White House has raised objections. We'll have to see if this can get worked out in committee. But this is a significant development for these Afghans who just have, literally weeks away. At this point, the White House has said the best option they have is to reapply for humanitarian parole, giving themselves another 24 months in order to get this visa status that would enable them to work in the United States.
Really a critical moment there for people in Afghanistan who are in the middle of this. But as that backlog continues, Jessica, the U.S. has now asked, we believe, the Philippines to temporarily house some of the Afghan refugees who have applied for U.S. visas. What sort of reaction is coming? What kind of reaction is coming from the Philippines on that? What more do we know on this?
Yeah, we know that President Biden, when he saw President Ferdinand Marcos Jr., did ask him about this program. But, there's a tremendous amount of domestic hesitancy in the Philippines about accepting large numbers of Afghan nationals into their country. Ferdinand Marcos was asked about this just in the past few days by Philippine reporters. He said, I'm still looking into it, I'm still weighing it, but there are security issues that we have to address. And the Afghan nationals at the center of these talks, though, have already been employed by the U.S. government through contracts, through U.S. military services. So there is the hope that vetting process to vet them as people who have already worked for the U.S. government will be able to ease the conscience of those in the Philippines who have security concerns. They are also in the process of applying for that special immigrant visa I mentioned earlier, and again, facing that backlog. So this would be an intermediary step that Manila does on behalf of attempting to help them in order to be a good partner to Washington.
Right, Jessica, thanks for that, and thank you very much for joining us this evening with the latest on what's happening domestically in America and the impact of that on the rest of the world as well. Thanks for that. Appreciate you joining us.